Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at some of our top stories. The World Health Organization has said that Gaza is facing a man-made mass starvation after a warning from over 100 aid agencies about the situation in the enclave. Meanwhile, Hamas says it has submitted a response to the latest Gaza peace proposal. Fresh drone strikes have been launched from both Russia and Ukraine following the conclusion of peace talks in Istanbul. Further prisoner swaps have been agreed, though the sides remain far apart over ceasefire terms. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with top EU chiefs in Beijing, kicking off a summit set to be dominated by trade and the Russia-Ukraine war. China has sought closer ties with the EU amid global trade tensions amid US tariffs. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron have discussed the ongoing EU-US trade dispute. Diplomats from the 27-nation bloc say they are heading towards a 15% deal with the US, though retaliatory tariffs are being prepped. This comes as talks between South Korea and the US have been postponed because of a scheduling conflict for US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Talks will be rescheduled as Seoul aims to make a deal ahead of the looming August 1st deadline. The White House has slammed a new claim made in the US media relating to the relationship of President Trump and late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein as fake news. The claim says Trump knew his name was in case files on Epstein amid pressure for them to be released. Columbia University has reached a deal worth over $220 million with the Trump administration following months of negotiation to restore federal funding. Columbia has been involved in a feud with Trump over alleged anti-Semitism on campus. Cambodia says that fresh border clashes have occurred with Thailand as both nations' militaries exchange fire at the disputed border. Both Southeast Asian nations blame the other for opening fire. But we start this hour in the Middle East, and the World Health Organization's chief has said that Gaza is suffering a man-made mass starvation caused by a blockade on aid going into the enclave. His comments come as more than 100 aid agencies warned of hunger in Gaza, while tons of food, clean water and medical supplies sit untouched just outside of the territory. Gaza's food stocks have run out. Israel, which cut off supplies to Gaza in March during its war with Hamas, lifted the blockade in May, but with strict restrictions. Israel says these controls are to prevent aid from falling into the hands of Hamas. Israel has also blamed Hamas for the suffering of Gaza's 2.2 million people. The WHO reported that at least 21 children have died from malnutrition this year, though the actual number is potentially higher. Meanwhile, Hamas has submitted its response to an Israeli proposal for a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza, following over 2 weeks of indirect talks in Qatar. The response reportedly includes amendments related to aid delivery, Israeli military withdrawals and guarantees for a permanent end to the war. The talks have dragged on for more than 2 weeks without a breakthrough, with each side blaming the other for refusing to budge on key demands. For Israel, dismantling Hamas's military and governing capabilities is a non-negotiable, while Hamas continues to demand firm guarantees on a lasting truce, a full withdrawal of Israeli troops and the free flow of aid into Gaza. While joining us to discuss these latest developments, Jim Rice, Professor of International Law, who's joining us from Vigan in the Philippines. Jim, as always, it is a pleasure to have you on the programme. A couple of parts that we need to dissect here. First, let's look at the World Health Organization's comments talking about man-made mass starvations in the face of more than 100 charities, of course, calling out the current situation. Can I get your initial thoughts on this response from the WHO and whether you think it will make a difference to the way that Israel are currently allowing aid into the enclave?
Thanks for having me on, Joshua. Well, my reaction is one of outrage and anger and sorrow. We don't have to look only to the World Health Organization. We can also look at the recent report by Amnesty International and another report by Human Rights Watch, all of which are pointing to a growing genocide in Gaza. And of course, it's man-made. It's been inflicted by the Israeli government and Netanyahu's rule on the innocent women and children of Gaza, who are now paying the price of other nations' just gross inhumanity. I have a lot to say on this. Please give me a follow-up.
Yes, absolutely. Of course I will, Jim. And I want to look at reports of the deaths now due to acute hunger and starvation, numbers of people, but also children dying because of starvation. The situation is a murky one, of course. The amount of reporting that takes place in Gaza is limited. A blockade from Israel on international journalists verifying much of this data that's coming from Hamas-run authorities. But clearly there is a consensus among many NGOs that the situation is deteriorating and it is a humanitarian crisis.
Basically, I could go on, having taught international law for many years, I can go on and tell your viewers how this is in breach of principles of humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict, but I think your viewers already know this. I'm just sick and tired of going on and talking about this again and again and again, and seemingly in a vacuum. And I'm really reminded of in 1971, in the conflict in the Bangladesh crisis, in which children were also starving during that time, in which there was a humanitarian movement coming together involving George Harrison and Ringo Starr and Bob Dylan and many others who came together and broadened the awareness of the crisis and the tragedy going on in Bangladesh. This is another such time. We need to come out with alternative voices. We can't just talk about simply this is a war crime. We all know it is.
Jim, I want to quickly move on to the diplomacy ongoing as both sides do reportedly look towards a ceasefire. Over 2 weeks of discussions in Qatar leading to a response from Hamas, but the situation seems to be the same. Hamas are looking for an immediate end to the war and a free movement, or at least improved movement of aid into the enclave. Israel, of course, are sticking with what they want, which is disarmament of Hamas. They want, of course, to make sure that October the 7th can't happen again. With both sides so strong on their views and what they want in this ceasefire, how can international actors make sure that a ceasefire is made, even if that leads to compromises from both sides?
Well, regardless of the wishes of the IDF or the wishes of Hamas, the fact of the matter is that innocents, children and women and non-combatants in Gaza should not be subjected to famine, should not be subjected to this collective punishment that's going on. Obviously, diplomacy needs to happen, and equally obviously, it hasn't been happening. So Hamas isn't budging, Israel isn't budging. Netanyahu wants this war to continue, and meanwhile, the people of Gaza just continue to die.
Jim Rice, thank you ever so much for joining us to discuss the ongoing situation in Gaza and the diplomacy surrounding it here on NewsX World. We will bring you all of those updates on both situations as we get them. But we now move over to Europe, and Ukraine has proposed direct peace talks between President Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin, with US and Turkish leaders also present by the end of August. Kyiv's lead negotiator said this was the top priority as Russia and Ukraine began their third round of talks in Istanbul. Let's have a listen to what Rustem Umerov, Ukraine's Security Council Secretary, had to say.
Number one is to organize a meeting of the leaders of presidents, where participation of President Trump and Erdogan will be most valuable. We propose to the Russian side to hold such a meeting of leaders until the end of August. By agreeing to this proposal, Russia can clearly demonstrate its constructive approach to everyone around the world, including our partners.
But Moscow's envoy said the sides remain far apart, though they agreed to continue contact. Let's listen now to Vladimir Medinsky, the chief Russian negotiator.
Ну и, естественно, мы долго обсуждали позиции, изложенные нашими сторонами в меморандумах, переданных в прошлый раз.
We also had a long exchange on the positions of the memoranda that we had exchanged last time.
Позиции достаточно далеки друг от друга.
The positions are quite distant from each other.
Но мы договорились продолжить контакт.
We have agreed to continue our contacts.
Как на уровне делегаций, так мы надеемся оперативно на уровне рабочих.
Well, this comes as Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan urged both parties to end the bloody war quickly and praised prior talks for achieving prisoner exchanges and laying groundwork for ceasefire discussions. We'll now have a listen to the Turkish Foreign Affairs Minister Hakan Fidan.
Amacımız bedeli bir hayli yüksek bu kanlı savaşı bir an önce sonlandırmaktır. Kere turunda temennimiz tarafların teati ettikleri muhtıralar üzerinde öze dönük ve sonuç odaklı istişareler gerçekleştirmeleridir. Nihai hedef elbette ki barışa giden yolu inşa edecek bir ateşkestir.
Well, joining us to discuss these diplomatic efforts that are ongoing, Madhav Nalapat, the editor of the Sunday Guardian, joining us live from New Delhi. Professor Nalapat, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. This is somewhat expected, of course, both sides still remaining far apart on particulars in a ceasefire deal, similar to what we've just spoken about with the Israel-Hamas conflict. But it does seem that diplomacy will continue, with Kyiv pushing for talks between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Do you think that this talk and this direct discussions, a third meeting between the nations in recent months, has any significance towards a potential peace deal?
Well, I'm seeing something which I never saw before in the Western media, which is criticism of Zelensky. Zelensky has been going after the Anti-Corruption Bureau in his own country, and there are widespread reports, published reports in Western media. I'm not talking about Chinese media or Russian media, but Western media, which have so far been cheerleaders for Zelensky, that, this is a wrong move, he should not have done it, and there should be an investigation of corruption. And, what is he covering up? So I think, frankly, that Western, the electorates are getting a little tired of funding this war. I mean, President Trump is sitting pretty. The Europeans are paying the cost of the weapons that he is supplying to Ukraine. And so he is sitting pretty. He's laughing all the way to the bank. But the fact of the matter is that the European public is getting a bit fed up of this kind of expenditure on a war that apparently seems to be going nowhere. So in
Professor
my view,
Nalapat, sorry to interject. I'm conscious of how much time we have, and I do want to briefly focus on these talks that have happened and try and dissect them. Of course, with no clear progress made on a ceasefire deal, what more could be needed in this instance, with a seeming impasse lasting for every single one of these three direct talks which have taken place in Istanbul?
Look, don't expect a Zelensky-Putin discussion, because the fact of the matter is that Putin believes Zelensky is not a partner in peace. Zelensky wants a ceasefire to try and regroup, to try and replenish his weapons. He's not interested in stopping the war, and the Russians know that. So I would be very surprised if they agree to a Putin-Zelensky meeting. They've agreed to lower-level meetings, and that's mostly for prisoner exchange on both sides. And the very tragic, situation of soldiers dying on both sides, and an exchange of the remains of these soldiers on both sides. So I don't expect any other development out of these talks. And Zelensky, Putin, well, I don't think the Russians are going to agree to that, because for them, Zelensky is not a partner in peace. And increasingly, from the comments that I've been seeing in Western media, I think the Western media also getting a bit tired of what was called in the past, endless wars, and this endless war in Ukraine. So my own view is that they're looking at an alternative leadership in Ukraine. So I would only like to say that as far as the Russians are concerned, I don't think they're going to stop. They're going to continue until they achieve their focus, which is that Ukraine should not be in any way a threat to Russia, which it very well will be if it joins NATO, because then any attack by Ukraine and the Russians then, if they attack back, then the Ukrainians can argue that NATO, but of course, NATO has got the right of self-defense. I don't think that that doctrine applies if a country launches an offensive on its own. We saw that in wars like Iraq and other places. But I'd like to say that I'm not very hopeful of this kind of talk leading anywhere. But I do hope that the family of these tragic, victims of the war will get, will get the remains of their loved ones back, and I do hope that then they will be, with full dignity and with all the rights associated with that they will be laid to rest finally.
Yes, Professor Nalapat, let's move on to that because we have some more information about the prisoner exchange, and Ukraine has brought home a new group of ill and wounded prisoners of war from Russia, bringing the total repatriated under the Istanbul peace talks to over 1,000. President Zelensky said many had spent more than 3 years in Russian captivity and are now receiving urgent medical care. At Wednesday's brief 40-minute session in Turkey, both sides agreed to exchange at least 1,200 more prisoners of war. Russia also offered to return 3,000 Ukrainian bodies. But major sticking points remain. Ukraine is pushing for a long-term ceasefire and a leaders' summit by August. Moscow, however, says the sides remain far apart. Ukraine also demanded the return of children. It says Russia has abducted at least 19,000, it is reporting. Moscow denies the charge, but says some children have been returned. Let's now listen to negotiators from both nations.
Well, our agreement and the result of this humanitarian track is more than 1,200 people. The exchanges will be done by our colleagues, and we will continue further our exchanges.
Но мы предложили Украине передать еще 3000 тел погибших украинских военнослужащих. Далее, продолжая обмены военнопленными, мы договорились о том, что в ближайшее время будет проведен обмен еще не менее чем по 1200 военнопленных с каждой стороны.
Well, thank you to Professor Nalapat for staying with us there. Of course, as you briefly mentioned just a short while ago, those prisoner exchanges, the body exchanges as well, are being agreed once again. This is realistically the only progress diplomatically that has been made in these talks, the same progress that was made in a similar type exchange in both the first and second round of negotiations. Do you think that this shows that diplomacy can lead these discussions? And amid pressure from the US and Western allies of Ukraine, do you think that peace is potentially on the horizon despite the gap that still remains between both Russia and Ukraine?
Look, as far as the US is concerned, Biden used to supply arms free of cost, like the Europeans are doing. And now Trump is saying, you pay me money, I'll give you the weapons. That's an entirely different. That's an entirely different deal from the past, quite frankly. But I'd like to say that I think the Russians are looking at a 1 or 2 day ceasefire, so that this exchange of the mortal remains of prisoners can take. Of prisoners and soldiers can take place. And I hope that is agreed upon by both sides, because it's really a terrible tragedy that we are seeing playing out in Ukraine and also in some parts of Russia. Both countries suffering unimaginable casualties, and every life lost is a precious life. So all I can say is I don't believe that the Russians want anything more than 1 or 2 days to basically exchange what they would like to exchange, and they're not going to agree to anything else. They're not going to agree to that, especially in a situation where the United States, under Joe Biden, used to give free of cost arms to the Ukrainians. Now the Americans are asking for cash on delivery or before delivery, before the weapons are delivered. It's becoming a very profitable business for them, this particular war. So I only want to say, I feel very sorry for the Ukrainian people. I feel very sorry for the individuals in those parts of Russia that are affected by this war. And I do hope that the war will end. But I don't see that happening until there's a genuine desire for peace and reconciliation on both sides.
Yes.
And as I said before, I think even our Ukrainian, even our European friends are understanding that Zelensky is not a partner in peace, which is why a lot of criticism has suddenly erupted against Zelensky for the first time since this war started in the European media, in media that was completely supportive of Zelensky. They've started criticizing his anti-corruption, his drive against the anti-corruption drive. So it's anti-corruption drive that he's launching. And I think that's a change in the atmosphere. And I do hope that there will be a new leader who will be open to the idea of a peace, of a long-term peace, on terms agreeable to both sides. And the suffering of the Ukrainians and suffering of some of the Russians
Yes.
will stop.
Yes,
That's all
Professor
I can
Nalapat.
hope.
Thank you ever so much. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you for joining us and providing that insight. We will, of course, continue to bring you all of the updates on the battlefield and through diplomacy in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We move on now, though, and tensions are flaring between Cambodia and Thailand as fresh clashes erupt along their disputed border. Cambodia's Defence Ministry confirmed exchanges of fire with Thai troops early on Thursday. That, according to Cambodia's former Prime Minister Hun Sen, 2 Cambodian provinces were shelled by the Thai army. The Thai military claims Cambodian forces initiated the attack. In response, Cambodia says its troops fired back after coming under assault. As the situation intensifies, Thailand has recalled its ambassador from Cambodia, and there are reports it may expel Cambodia's ambassador in retaliation. Well, joining us to discuss this latest development in clashes that have been ongoing between Thailand and Cambodia, Dr. Satoru Nagao, a fellow at the Hudson Institute, joining us live from Tokyo, Japan. Dr. Nagao, as always, thank you for taking the time to speak with us this morning. Let's look at this situation. Both sides blaming the other for opening fire, a border dispute that is long-standing, with shelling and fire being exchanged, the diplomacy and the diplomatic efforts as well of removing ambassadors. That is the current situation as we see it today. But could you provide us with some context as to how we got here and what the ramifications of these further tensions are?
Yes, the tension is escalating because both sides hasn't satisfied the current situation. So originally, this has a problem related to the imperial age. When France colonialized Cambodia and Thailand was independent at that age, but France takes some territory, and so after the France colonialization has ended, the Cambodia is independent country, but Thailand claimed some parts because of France took some territory from Thailand. So that's why both Cambodia side, Thailand side claim the same territory. But after the international court decision, the United Nations decided this is the Cambodian side territory and Thailand withdraw some part. But still Cambodia as claim is more wider and this area as Thailand controlled area. So there is a territory issue between two for a long time because of this. But recent crash has happened because firstly crash has happened in May, and that time the Cambodia soldier was dead. One Cambodia soldier was dead. But after that, this month, unidentified mine is setting up the Thailand side, and Thailand soldiers are injured. So it looks like, view from the situation, it is retaliation. There is a possibility, this is a possibility, but retaliation has happened from the Cambodian side. And so that's why the Thailand side is upset and start to attack it, and the Cambodian side also attack it, and the crash is escalating. In this case, Cambodian side is very frustrated, it looks like, because they are indeed seeking it looks like regime change of the Thailand, because when the two leaders negotiate, and the videotape of this negotiation has revealed, and at that time the Thailand Prime Minister said the Thailand army its action, and indeed it looks like she criticized activity of the Thailand side. So that's why this was a scandal in the Thailand politics. But why this has revealed? Because Cambodian side released this negotiation video, negotiation tape. So that's why Cambodian side want to make pressure, and by through this negotiation tape, making the scandal itself is the Cambodian side is offensive against Thailand. So that's why indeed Cambodian side is a little bit offense style against Thailand. It looks
yes,
like.
Dr. Nagao, we do need to move on, but you are staying with us. Thank you for that insight. We now move to Europe once again, as French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz met in Berlin today to discuss a range of critical issues. The leaders focused on the ongoing trade dispute with the US over tariffs. I just want to clarify that this meeting hasn't taken place today. It took place yesterday. Apologies for that. And this comes as President Donald Trump's August 1st deadline approaches. Both leaders expressed optimism, with Macron emphasising the need for the EU to be respected as equal partners. Let's now listen to French President Emmanuel Macron.
Après les échanges des derniers jours, nous avons été en contact permanent avec Monsieur le Chancelier, également avec notre collègue italienne, nos autres collègues européens et avec la présidente de la Commission pour suivre, impulser, coordonner notre réponse aujourd'hui à l'offensive tarifaire qui a été lancée, avec une volonté que nous partageons, c'est de donner de la stabilité et d'avoir les tarifs les plus bas possibles. Mais également, évidemment, d'être respectés comme des partenaires que nous sommes, qui avons toujours été...
Well, the two are also working on a trade agreement to potentially impose 15% tariffs on European imports. The EU is, however, preparing countermeasures, including over $100 billion in retaliatory tariffs if talks fail. Well, I'd like to welcome back Dr. Nagao. Thank you ever so much for staying with us. This conversation around tariffs is one that we have had many times, Dr. Nagao, but serious work going into these negotiations. It is a bit of a copy and paste with all of the other countries that are currently holding these talks, but of course the EU bloc made up of 27 separate nations. How significant for both sides is it that this deal gets done in time at a rate that both countries are happy with, looking at the US imbalance, but also no retaliatory tariffs from the EU?
Yes, because of the size of the trade, this is very important for both sides. But at the same time, deadline is 1st August, so this means that only 1 week from now, so negotiation is, this is entering the final phase. And just in the Japan and the US has already agreed, so that's why this is the base to the negotiation. That time this tariff is 15%. So compared with the 27.5%, 15% is lower, but still they need to pay, EU side need to pay. This is a disadvantage for the EU. But at the same time, if both sides impose retaliation tariff, this is not constructive for both sides. So this means that indeed the retaliation style is not working so well in this case. So that's why before the deadline, they try to agree and conclude agree based on the agreement between US and Japan.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Nagao, thank you so much for joining us on both of those topics and providing that insight. As Trump's tariff deadline gets ever closer, of course, August the 1st, we will continue to bring you all of the diplomatic developments between the US and their trading partners. But that is all we have time for. We'll continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world. Thank you.